I'm recording this video during the most ludicrously loud thunderstorm in my entire life. Because the universe hates me. So I just saw Black Widow, and boy was that a good time. Not gonna lie, more than a lot of other MCU movies, the sense of apathy I'm getting from some people on this one baffles me. Like, different strokes, I get it, but there are people who will praise MCU movies that even I have a hard time giving a free pass, but for whatever reason couldn't jive with this one. And I feel like I'm surrounded by crazy people. I loved it, and I saw it with my sister and friend Brianna, and they both loved it. Hell, it's actually Brianna's favorite MCU movie now. Whether it's mid or top tier by my standards will probably depend on a couple more viewings for me, but yeah. I think a lot of people just have trouble accepting it on premise. I, for one, can't relate to those who let the understandable bitterness that this movie wasn't made years ago detract from it, or those struggling to get invested in this story because we already know that she's dead. I just think— oh, endgame spoilers, by the way. I think that's kind of a weird thing to let make or break a movie for you. I also don't subscribe to the thinking that this movie had extra pressure on it to posthumously elevate Natasha's character. Nat's character and presence in this franchise is already meaningful enough. This movie didn't really have to do anything to justify its existence beyond telling a compelling story, and I think it did that. It's probably one of the most emotionally mature stories that Marvel Studios has put out, and for me it perfectly rides the line between an arch, over-the-top spy piece and a grounded narrative about one of the most underappreciated characters in this whole mega franchise. Well, there's some exceptions to that balance, but we'll get into that in a sec. You probably already know about my pre-existing thoughts on the character of Natasha Romanoff. My video on the subject is one of the few that's actually ever performed decently. But if you haven't seen that, go give it a watch, and hey, maybe also subscribe? Natasha's a character I've always felt was unfairly dismissed, more so by the audience than she ever was by the movies. And by framing itself around Nat's attempts to reconnect with her former spy family as they take down the very Black Widow program responsible for her training, this movie efficiently interrogates and lends further depth to some key inner conflicts. Specifically, I like that the film subtly asks whether Nat has let her trauma over the Red Room and her conditioning make her subconsciously resistant to the very sense of family she's spent so much screen time craving. It's a great idea that informs her arc in the other movies well, I think, and the movie treats it seriously. Not to say that the film is without laughs, though I'm sure plenty of people wish it was. Personally, I appreciate the levity, for the most part, and I think it's frankly a miracle, and speaks to the strength of the gags that are here, that I didn't find them obnoxious despite being in a theater with a woman who insisted on cackling like a hyena through every single joke. I'd be more than justified in hating all of the gags with that filter, believe you me. A big part of what works about some of the jokes is that in many places it's the blackest comedy in the MCU by a wide margin. There's at least 2 scenes in this movie where a situation is so dark but also so absurd, and it's just left there to hang for minutes on end while you're not sure whether to laugh or be genuinely uncomfortable, even horrified for or even of these characters. The movie as a whole does not shy away from dark and troubling stuff. That said, it's not ultimately a bleak story for the characters themselves, and I think the movie earns its ultimate sense of optimism. Speaking of the characters, they're really what carries the film. Florence Pugh has gotten by far the most praise as Yelena, and it's well earned since she sells some of the most emotional moments in this entire franchise like it's nothing. That said, it remains Scarlett Johansson's movie throughout, and it's a pleasure as always to watch the woman work. This movie slots in perfectly between Civil War and Infinity War, and the story goes out of its way to justify that narrative placement as being a particularly vulnerable point in Nat's personal history. I also really like how Nat's status as an Avenger plays into the movie, and the digs that the other characters get on her for being one work for me almost like a subtle metaphor for the kind of bitterness that you might see in a family unit when one member manages some upward mobility and leaves the rest behind. It's almost nothing but a problem for Nat in this movie, something that emphasizes how ostracized she is from the others for having escaped the system they couldn't, and I really like that that's almost all it is in the context of this story. Something that could have almost felt like an unearned sense of narrative power compared to the rest of her family instead weighs like an anchor around Nat's neck, and I just think that's a really smart writing choice. The core of the film is Pugh and ScarJo's double act, with Rachel Weisz and David Harbour in support. Harbour's Red Guardian is another figure getting a lot of love, but I gotta admit, I'm not fully here for it on that one. If anything, I think Harbor's Alexei is actually my biggest problem with the film. Don't get me wrong, I like the guy, but if the humor of the movie falters anywhere, it's with him. The jokes are funny, still, but that's almost all there is to this character. Not only that, but he doesn't really get to shine in any action scenes either, and when compared with the three ladies, he contributes almost nothing to the plot. There's maybe one token moment in the movie where he's allowed to act like a human being, as opposed to the comic relief character trademark, and it's always with him that I'm pulled out of the drama of the movie. It's kind of like being pulled out of the flow of a video by yet another reminder to subscribe and hit the bell, so I feel justified in making these. Anyway, don't get me wrong, there are parts where the whole shtick works, where it actually contributes to the drama because Alexei comes off more straight up deluded and senile than he does buffoonish, but I wish the character felt less one note. I think I actually prefer Wise, on paper anyway, as a more layered character who still entertains. Ray Winstone as Dreykov, with comparatively little screen time, is one of the most heinous, hateable villains the MCU has ever had, if not the most. There's few MCU baddies you want to see dead quite like this numbnuts. It's impressive and viscerally uncomfortable. Turns out this was true for my sister Eden in particular, and rather than speak to her experience, I might as well let her have the mic for a sec. Take it away, sister o' mine.
Thanks for the mic, brother of mine. Conversely to your opinion, I actually really liked the Red Guardian as a tool of comic relief. Not particularly because I laughed hard at any of his jokes, although some of them were pretty funny, but more because it puts him in contrast to the main antagonist of the movie. Both, to Natasha, are powerful male forms of abuse. And I will say that walking out of the theater, I realized that I had never been in a movie where my experience was more gendered than the one I was watching currently. I was invited to watch this movie alongside Nick and Brianna by my friends, most of whom are, well, male teenagers, and it was only being surrounded by youthful masculinity that I realized I was surrounded by people who don't have the same fear and trauma that I do relating to assault and abuse as a young woman, and it played into my feelings towards the movie. I'd never felt more viscerally alone and vulnerable with no one to hold on to in a theater than when Natasha and the other women in the movie were in that same vulnerable position. I compliment this movie for being mature and well made enough in everything from shot composition to the music, like the amazing Taskmaster theme, to especially the acting for pulling out that feeling. Especially Scarlett Johansson, who I don't think has ever been better, sans maybe her death scene in Endgame. It was a really strange feeling. During these several moments that dealt with the movie's Weinstein-Epstein-coded villain, where I genuinely felt frightened that someone in the theater was going to hurt or manipulate me. I'd never been more thankful to go home in a mostly empty train car, and I actually had nightmares about it that night. So much of the fear and the framing of him in the movie is literally palpable, to the point where I felt uncomfortable holding my friend's shoulder, specifically because I knew he wouldn't relate to the experience. Trigger warning for the mention here, but even as somebody who hasn't been raped or sexually assaulted or groomed as a child, and especially not in the circumstances of being made into an international super spy assassin, I still genuinely felt a constant unnerving creepiness around every single shot. That this idea that he was going to come out of the screen and literally make every girl in the theater his tool. It was grrr. Anyway, subscribe to my brother.
Dreykov ties into what might be something of an elephant in the room, though. One of the more controversial choices in the movie, in much the same vein as Iron Man 3, is Taskmaster. Before I say anything, grain of salt. I have zero investment in Taskmaster as they're characterized in the comics or other media. The most I've ever cared about this character was in Marvel vs. Capcom 3. Keeping that in mind, I like what this movie does with Taskmaster. I like it a lot. What we do with them at the end, really the entire third act, is the ultimate externalization of something that's been true about Nat for a long time. Namely the way she will let others victimize her for the greater good, and it's tragic but also cathartic to watch play out in the best way. The way Taskmaster is utilized here is the perfect story beat for Natasha's character arc. It's a dark, twisted concept, and it leaves the door open for another different Taskmaster if at any point we decide that's what we want to do. Just like with the Mandarin. Man, I wish I could keep the hot takes rolling, but the rest of what I have to say likely won't be as inflammatory. I'm learning more and more that I'm a real easy lay for action scenes, so keep that in mind when I say I dig the action here. It's fun, tense, the hits feel visceral with some notable exceptions, and it manages all that with an almost entirely superpower-less cast. I also quite like the Lauren Balfe score, for what that's worth. I don't know, I understand at this point that me being an MCU shill just means it's a day ending in Y, but honestly, I thought Black Widow was just a great time at the movies, and with some minor tweakable bits, probably the best execution of this concept I could have hoped for. But what did you think? If you're someone who liked it less, maybe you can enlighten me as to why in the comments. And, subscribe! Anyway, I'll see ya.